Hi, this is Scott Maybe, and I want to talk to you today about purchasing ethics and sharp practices in supply management. We've looked at the agent and principal principle, as well as the personal liability of the buyer when and where the buyer might be personally liable. We looked at the various conditions required in the formation of a contract to make a contract legally binding. And we also looked at the different types of warranties and the rights of the buyer and supplier. So we're going to end this with just looking at ethics in purchasing and what ethics are and what the different forms of ethical practices and non-ethical practices are. And then also looking at sharp practices, practices which are questionable and best avoided in purchasing. Because ethics are so important, because a buyer has a lot of power. As a general agent, there's a lot of power granted to the buyer, and that can be tempting to abuse that power and not only act in ways which are unethical, but also act in illegal ways. So we need to avoid those in the role of a buyer. So what is ethics? Ethics is a set of moral principles or values guiding our behavior. So our behavior is oftentimes guided by the principles and values that we share in our society. So business ethical behavior is use of recognized social principles involving justice and fairness. And buyers should always treat suppliers in a just, decent, fair, and honest and fitting manner. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't negotiate with a seller with a win-lose attitude if that is the nature of the negotiating environment. It just means that I have to do it in a fair and honest and fitting manner, and I can't violate some of the ethical standards of the trade. So the rules of ethical behavior: the buyer must commit their attention and energies for the organization's benefit rather than for personal enrichment. The buyer has a lot of power, as I've said, and in doing so, it can be tempting to act in your own personal interest rather than the organization's interest. But the only reason why you've been granted power is ultimately because you're a general agent in the eyes of the law, not because you hold any personal power yourself. So therefore, there should be no connection with your personal position and the position that you hold as a buyer. So you must not accept outside gifts or favors or bribes of any kind. You must not be tempted or influenced by unethical practices of any of the salespeople around you. So even if they're unethical, you must act in a fully ethical manner. And you must not have personal financial arrangements with any suppliers of any kind. Buyers must act ethically towards suppliers and potential suppliers. Treat suppliers professionally and with respect. Buyers must uphold the ethical standards set forth by their professional organization and their profession. So whether you're an engineer and you're engaging in purchasing, or if you're a project manager and you're holding a PMP or a CAPM, you're going to be held to the standards of your organizational governing body, in that case, the Project Management Institute. So you need to make sure you understand what those standards are. Now, sharp practices are practices you want to avoid as a buyer. So the first thing you want to do is you want to avoid willful use of misinformation. Okay, so if you're misinforming suppliers, but you're doing it with good intention and you have there's no knowledge that you would have that the information is not correct, then you need to exercise your due diligence to make sure that you get information that's correct. But it's especially bad if you're willfully using misinformation. And that leads to exaggerating problems. You don't want to tell the supplier something that's not true, to exaggerate the problem or any problems that the supplier is having, or any problems within the marketplace. So you're taking facts and you're misleading the supplier, and that's something you want to avoid. You definitely want to avoid requesting bids if you're in a situation where you are doing a request for X, or a request for proposal, or request for quotation. You want to avoid requesting bids from unqualified suppliers solely for driving prices down from qualified suppliers. If you're not going to actually consider any suppliers in the public bid, then why are you including them? Well, the common answer is that you're trying to increase competition, which drives down prices. That is totally something you want to avoid. And gaining information unfairly through deception. So you don't want to be misleading suppliers in order for them to share information with you. You don't want to share information on competitive quotations. So if a supplier is giving you a quotation, you never want to share that with another supplier. That's always meant to be private. Many buyers do this, but it's always discouraged, and I would say that it's definitely a sharp practice. It creates a very bad reputation for you and for your organization over time, and many suppliers may just simply not want to do business with you. Not compensating supplier for design or other work, that's something that is not illegal, but it could be considered unethical. If suppliers are doing extra work, they should be compensated in some way. If not monetarily, possibly through an award or through some sort of recognition. But when suppliers are going above and beyond consistently, there should be some form of compensation for them. Taking unfair advantage of a supplier's financial situation is not illegal, but it's not best practice in the field. So sharp practices mean that you stick to the original requisition or the original requirement of the organization, and you don't exploit the supplier's current financial situation for gain of your organization. That's a sharp practice and ultimately leads to tarnishing your reputation and the relationship between the supplier and the buyer over time. And of course, you want to not lie or mislead. You want to be honest and open with your suppliers. So here's the different forms of unethical behavior. There are 6 of them. The first is accepting supplier favors. Accepting supplier favors in most companies is against corporate policy. And that can take the form of obviously cash gifts all the way to accepting free meals or tickets to certain events. But anything that you're personally accepting in your role is considered a supplier favor. Even if it's perceived to be a supplier favor, as a buyer, you have to be aware of how you're being perceived at all times. So going out to a dinner with a supplier, know that that is something that could be perceived as influencing or manipulating your decision to do business with that supplier. Reciprocity is unethical behavior. There's nothing wrong with reciprocity on the surface. If you don't know what reciprocity is, you can look it up. But essentially what it is quid pro quo. It's what's good for me is good for you. So as a buyer, if I'm buying products that you're producing, and I'm also producing products of my own, then I may eventually sell you something that you buy from me because I buy so much from you. And that's reciprocity. There's nothing wrong with that on the surface, but if it's used in any way to influence the purchasing decision itself, it's unethical. Personal buying. Personal buying is when I'm using my position as a buyer to buy something from my supplier for myself. So I'm in turn benefiting from the favorable pricing that my organization is getting from my suppliers for my own personal use, which is also unethical. Another unethical form of behavior is financial conflicts of interest. These are similar to personal buying, but it's conflicts of interest because the supplier and I have a relationship of some kind. I have a financial connection of some kind, or my family has a financial connection of some kind to my suppliers. So if my suppliers are awarded business, I or my family gain financially from that relationship. So we need to make sure that we understand what our financial conflicts of interest are, and we don't act out in those because that can be considered unethical as well. Personal conflicts of interest are not necessarily financial conflicts of interest, but they are more political based, or we still gain a social elevation from the conflict of interest itself. So personal conflicts of interest can take the form of, for example, helping out a friend of mine who is a supplier, or helping out a former colleague of mine who's now looking to solicit business with my organization. That's a personal conflict of interest. I'm not necessarily going to financially, or my family's not going to financially gain from that, but it makes me look good, and it improves my social status. And that's something we also have to be wary of as unethical behavior. And last but not least, disclosure of confidential or proprietary information, whether it's confidential information from our organization or confidential information from a previous employer we worked with, or confidential information or secret information from another supplier. We need to make sure that we're not disclosing that information. It's confidential and proprietary for a reason. It needs to be between the parties that we are conducting business with and left only between those parties. So let's take a look at some of these with some examples, some example questions. Okay, so a buyer places an order with a supplier to purchase materials to use to build the buyer's house. This is an example of which of these. Pause the video and take a moment to review the question and the possible 6 forms of unethical behavior and determine which one is the best match for this example. Okay, so the buyer places an order with a supplier to buy materials to build their house. It's clearly personal buying. The buyer is trying to benefit from the favorable pricing that the supplier is giving to their organization. That's a personal buying situation. So we want to avoid those issues by having it so that the buyer buys the materials from the supplier at the price they would pay as an individual, not at the price they would pay as an organization. A buyer awards a contract to a supplier that also purchases a large volume of products from the buyer's company. This is an example of, pause the video and review the question, determine which one of these 6 forms of unethical practices would best match. So the buyer awards a contract to a supplier that also purchases a large volume of products from the buyer's company. Well, that's clearly an example of reciprocity. So the buyer's buying something, awarding a contract to a supplier, and that supplier also purchases a large volume of products from the buyer's company. That's reciprocity. There's nothing directly wrong with that. But if the buyer is awarding contracts to a supplier over and over that's doing that, then it's an issue of unethical practices. The relationship between buyer and seller and buyer should never influence a public bidding in terms of an RFQ or an RFP. That relationship should be non-irrelevant, should be completely irrelevant to which supplier is awarded that contract. So that's a form of reciprocity. The project manager awards an RFP to a company that they used to work for. This is an example of, pause the video and review the question to determine which one of these 6 unethical practices would be a best match for this case. So the project manager awards an RFP to a company they used to work for. Well, if they have a good relationship with that company, that's a personal conflict of interest. They're trying to help out a previous company that they worked for and maybe have a good relationship with. And that's a personal conflict of interest because it improves the social status of that individual and it helps build their network. But that's a really bad reason for the project manager to award the RFP to any company. The reason why you'd award an RFP is because it's the best proposal, not because that person has a personal connection with the seller. Here's another example. A project manager awards an RFP to a company owned by their nephew. This is an example of, pause the video and pick the best answer. So it's owned by their nephew. It means that that's within the family, within their direct family. And so, of course, that's a financial conflict of interest. If the project manager is awarding an RFP to a company owned by their nephew, it means the nephew is going to financially benefit from that. And of course, that is unethical. The project manager should be awarding an RFP to the best company, not to a company that has a direct financial interest that's owned by someone, either them or a member of their family. A buyer shares pricing and volume information from their current supplier to prospective supplier. This is an example of which one of these. Pause the video, review the information above, and determine which would be the best match. So buyer sharing pricing information and volume information between suppliers is obviously disclosure of confidential or proprietary information. You should never be sharing information that's confidential or proprietary between sellers. It's just a basic unethical form of practice. A buyer receives free tickets to a hockey game from a supplier. This is an example of which of these 6 forms of unethical practices. Pause the video, consider the question, and answer to the best of your ability. So if the buyer receives free tickets, it's obviously accepting supplier favors in the form of free tickets or cash, or even just invitations to an event that would have to be paid for. You want to avoid all that, or just even being perceived as accepting supplier favors. Be very, very careful with anything that could be perceived as influencing your decision to do business with one seller over another. And these are the different forms of sharp practices and unethical practices in purchasing. So hopefully that helped you to better understand the material and be able to understand the difference between all these 6 forms of unethical behaviors and the sharp practices which are best to avoid, which are related to the unethical behaviors, but specific practices that you want to avoid as future purchasers or even project managers or supply managers. And most of these are also included in governing bodies such as the PMI, etc.